Okay, hello everyone. We are looking at focus section 5. We'll be starting our hematology section, which includes blood, platelets, blood formation, and immune cells. So for our agenda, let's kind of go over what is blood, the difference between homeostasis and hemostasis, and then go over the life of a red blood cell, kind of the things that you want to know for this session. And then I'll cover any questions. Okay, so the first thing is what is blood? So what blood is made up of primarily three things, or really two things. You have the formed elements, which include your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. And then the plasma, which is primarily made up of water, but also contains proteins, including albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen, has ions, and also contains our nutrients and waste. Quickly, for the formed elements, our red blood cells carry oxygen and CO2, either to our tissues or oxygen to our tissues and CO2 out of our tissues to the environment. White blood cells or leukocytes primarily are involved in our immune response. That's something I will cover in our focus session 6, primarily leukocytes only. And then platelets or our thrombocytes are involved in hemostasis, which is a fancy term for basically maintaining the level of blood we have in the body. So the first thing I'm going to cover for this one is kind of go over homeostasis and hemostasis, some basic terminology that you want to know for these next 2 weeks. So erythrocyte, homeostasis. Basically, why do we need more blood? Typically, we need more blood because our tissues are not getting the appropriate amount of oxygen that we need. This condition is called hypoxemia or a low oxygen condition. Things that could cause low oxygen in the body, more exercise, high altitude, and one you might be thinking of is blood loss or hemorrhaging. So if you kind of think it through, when we exercise more, right now we are at a certain homeostasis where we want to, I have a certain level of fitness, whereas, I take my daily walks. My body knows that you're going to take daily walks, you need X amount of oxygen throughout the day. As you start working out, you'll realize like, oh, you're getting tired more easily, you're breathing heavy, your muscles start to cramp up. Um, your body is not conditioned to have that oxygen supplied to the tissues to do the fitness or all the work that you're doing. And if you really think about it, if I work out one day and then decide to go work out the next day, it's still not as easy as it was the day before. It feels about the same. You're still stressing around and breathing hard and doing all those other things. But if you keep exercising every day, you'll realize in like a week or 2 weeks, now you're not breathing as heavy. Your heart rate's a little lower. You may not be sweating as much. And it has to do with your body realizing that, all right, your current fitness levels, what you're doing day to day is not enough, uh, is too much for your body to handle. So I needed more oxygen. So the body will actually start the process of um, creating more blood cells so that you can carry the oxygen you need to the tissues. And then in 2 weeks, you're ready, you're fit, you're feeling really good, you can breathe better. And then if you keep working out that way, your body will keep making more blood to make up for that loss or to make up for your tissues needing that oxygen. When you go to high altitudes, so there's uh, as you go into higher elevations, your your how do I explain this? Your blood cells don't hold on to the oxygen as easily as it does at like sea level or below sea level. And so to make up for that, your body needs to make more blood cells so that you can carry the right amount of oxygen. So if you go to Denver, you'll see this in like high elevations is where you're up there, you're kind of doing your normal strenuous things, you're walking, you're talking, whatever, but you'll feel more tired doing it. That's because your body cannot take in the same amount of oxygen as it could here in Phoenix. And again, blood loss or hemorrhaging, that's the main basic one that everyone thinks about. Homeostasis is part of a negative feedback loop. So again, if I work out heavily for the next 2 months, my body's going to keep pulling for me to make more oxygen. However, if I stop working out for 2 months, after a while, the body's going to realize I'm making too much oxygen. I need to get rid of red blood cells and not make more red blood cells to then bring you at a homeostasis, a balance. Um, the mechanism that causes you to make more red blood cells is through the kidney. So the kidney will realize that you have a low oxygen or a hypoxemic condition, and it'll release a protein slash enzyme called erythropoietin, which then stimulates the red blood cell production in bone marrow. And I'll kind of cover that here in the next slide. And then very briefly, hemostasis, again, is maintaining the amount of blood in your body, typically from blood loss. And there's three phases that go into this: vascular spasm, platelet plug, including adhesion, activation, and aggregation, and coagulation. Now, I'm not going to cover hemostasis in this lecture. However, next week, when we start preparing for the exam, I'm going to cover uh, leukocytes or white blood cells, and I'm going to cover hemostasis more in detail. I just wanted you to see the basics for hemostasis, and hopefully you can start making those connections as you go through the lecture material these next 2 weeks. Okay, the biggest thing I want to talk about today is the life of the red blood cell. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, a low oxygen or hypoxemic condition causes your body to want to make more red blood cells. I kind of see what I drew here. Back when I was a student, we also had to talk about how the red blood cells get recycled in the body. But for this class, we're not going to talk about that. You don't need it anymore. So we're going to focus primarily on the production of the red blood cell, not so much the destruction of the red blood cell. So again, low oxygen condition in the kidney causes the release of EPO or erythropoietin, and that stimulates erythropoiesis in the bone marrow. So the way I've broken this down is that here in the green, I have what happens in your bone marrow. And then in this light pink purple color, I mentioned what happens in the blood vessels. So once your body gets the sign to make more red blood cells, our body can make about 2.5 million red blood cells per second, which is pretty impressive. You're going to start with a erythroblast. So what makes red blood cells unique is that they are not like our normal cells. Their only function is to carry oxygen and get rid of CO2. So all the things that you know of in Bio 181 that cells have, right? A nucleus, you got ribosomes, you've got other proteins, you got the plasma, you've got your ERs, smooth and rough ER, all those things. The blood cells start with those, but then it gets rid of them because their only purpose is to carry blood. Or sorry, their only purpose is to carry oxygen. Because we don't have those cellular mechanisms in red blood cells cannot repair themselves. And so they'll only last for about 4 months or 120 days before the red blood cell just doesn't function anymore and has to get recycled. So we start off with a erythroblast. So over the course of 3 to 4 days, the red blood cell is going to start developing in the blood marrow. It's going to have all the things you expect, the nucleus, ER, some other stuff. But what's going to happen is it's going to start transitioning itself into what's called a normal blast. So the red blood cell is going to start getting rid of its cell parts to make more room for stuff to hold oxygen and CO2. At the very end of the 4 day mark, you're now what's called a normal blast, and you have basically gotten rid of your nucleus, you've gotten rid of some of your other organelles, and you just have a few organelles left in the normal blast. At around day 4, you get released into the blood cell as a premature red blood cell or a reticulocyte. And then over the next 24 hours, the reticulocyte is going to get rid of its last remaining organelles. And then after that, you'll become a full red blood cell. And this red blood cell's only um, purpose in life is to carry oxygen and CO2. What's very unique about red blood cells, or what makes them special, is they have this biconcave shape, which increases the surface area for carrying oxygen. They're also able to kind of twist around, and so their red blood cells can go from our main arteries and veins, like our aorta or our inferior vena cava, and they're able to squeeze together to get into the very tiny blood vessels in our fingers or in our toes, that kind of thing. Again, because they have no organelles, they have that very flexible structure where they can kind of stretch and pull. Red blood cells, because of their shape, can also stack together, so you can deliver more red blood cells kind of like in a row through your blood vessels. And again, without those organelles, you increase the volume and diffusion rate of oxygen and CO2. Um, each of the red blood cells contain what's called hemoglobin, and that's something we'll cover later in the lecture. But for the most part, hemoglobin is a chemical structure that can hold 4 oxygen molecules. So a full red blood cell can carry 4 oxygen molecules at a time. Now, after 120 days, if you can imagine, that red blood cell is getting pulled. It's going into smaller blood vessels and squeezing through, then squeezing out into our main arteries and veins. Um, you might have damage in between now and then, even if you don't have like a big blood loss, any bruising, just general wear and tear of your body can cause red blood cells to start having their own wear and tear. And over 120 days, the red blood cell really struggles to keep up its function of transporting oxygen and CO2. And so essentially, the red blood cell after 120 days is so used up that the body decides to recycle it. Again, this process typically happens in the spleen, the liver, and in our bone marrow. And our macrophages, which are big eaters, they are part of our immune system. They'll basically eat the red blood cells and they'll start breaking the parts around. One of the things that we do is we recycle what's called heme, and that gets basically sent over back to the bone marrow to then reuse the heme to make more red blood cells. And then the leftover stuff, as you can kind of see here, starts getting broken down and decomposed, and eventually we'll release chunks of it in our either our pee or uh, or our fecal matter, if you will. Um, that's really all I wanted to cover today was the life of the red blood cell. You can draw something very similar to this. Like I said, this is how I drew it because I liked color coding it. You can kind of see on the left, I put what blood is made of, some of the purposes of blood. You can see on the right where I kind of mentioned the special features of red blood cells. That's something that you want to study for as well. But again, everything below the macrophage portion, even really the heme and the transferrin portion, you don't need to know that. Just know the life of the red blood cell, including the things that cause it to create cause that are causing your body to create the low oxygen condition, where EPO is released from, i.e., the kidney, where it acts, which is your red bone marrow, and then in general, a quick summary of each of the phases of the developing red blood cell from the erythroblast all the way to the red blood cell. And that's basically it. This chapter is going to be much easier than um, endocrine, than cardiovascular. Um, Really, the only thing that might be difficult or more challenging this time around is the white blood cells, especially the specific white blood cells that we have in our body and how they defend us against different pathogens. But next week, I'll go over my favorite scenario, which is I'm going to pretend I'm sick, and I'm going to tell you how my body, different layers of my body, are protecting me from this infection. Um, Other than that, does anyone have any questions? I saw that I got someone added. Quinn, do you have any questions for me?
Um, yeah, just a quick one that doesn't relate to this, and then the other was after. So when